One of the things I often hear from other designers or just other people interested in ML as they get started is that the hardest thing is like, how do I find a model, or like, how do I find a model that does what I want it to do? And I would imagine, especially if you're working with a product team, one of the things you're going to need to figure out is how to quickly run experiments, how to quickly like R&D a thing to figure out if it works before you begin to build out an entire pipeline for this process. So, especially, your engineers might be like, it takes a couple weeks to train a model. Like, we don't really want to waste time doing that. Is there a model off the shelf that we can start to play with, learn about, experiment with, and then build our own once we've figured out how it all works? And there's lots of different ways to do this. There's people to follow on Twitter. There's newsletters to sign up for. There's a ton of different websites. I want to talk about two websites that I tend to use quite a lot when I'm looking for stuff to use. The first is Hugging Face. You can go ahead and create an account here. If you want to, just hit the sign up button up here. I do actually recommend signing in because in some cases you have to get permission to various projects. But for now, we'll just go through the logged out experience. I'll also probably this week and maybe even the next couple weeks, I'll also cover some materials on how to use some of their training services, which do cost money. For stuff like image classification or text classification, I think it costs about $10 to $20 per model, but that's actually far, far cheaper than some whole AWS setup, which is kind of confusing. The other thing that's really nice we'll talk about a little bit are Hugging Face Spaces. This will be really, really helpful, especially for you as a designer to sort of understand what the features are. So let's just start about how I would go about sort of like looking for models. So there are up here, models, data sets, spaces. You can sort of go through them, but I do find that like honestly, search is probably the best. So, this week we're talking about text classifiers. So let's just see what they have in terms of text classifiers. And you'll see here, what pops up are models, spaces, and so models are essentially the model files. Hugging Face acts a little bit like a GitHub where people can upload their own code as well as upload their model files. There are also data sets. Let's see if I get text. Yeah, so you'll see data sets. So there are data sets, in this case, of text. And that, again, are like the files that people were training on. So this will be the files of, in this case, text files or text lines of text. There's also image data sets. There's probably sound data sets and other things on here as well. And then lastly are spaces. And spaces are an interactive playground where you can essentially use their sort of default UI to begin to play with different things. So let's actually look for maybe a text classifier that we want to try. So, one of the most common ones is a sentiment analysis. And you'll see here there's a bunch of different, so Distilbert, BERT base. BERT seems to be a common one. Looks like there's some that are in Turkish, Arabic, multilingual, fine-tuned financial news. That's kind of interesting. Then we've got data sets here, so there's a bunch of data set information, but let's go ahead and just click on one of these spaces. So if you want to see all the spaces, you can click on this, and you'll see here's an interface. Now, again, one of the challenges here is that you kind of have to like read between the lines. What does it mean to do, Arabic sentiment analyzer? Well, obviously it's probably gonna be on Arabic text. There are other ones here, that just look like they're sentiment classifications. In general, what I would recommend you do is avoid the ones that say they have build errors or runtime errors. This usually means that there's an issue with them. Maybe they're out of date or maybe they're just not working. But you can usually sort of click on one and just sort of open it and see what happens. Let's go ahead and click on this real-time sentiment analysis one. And there is a little bit here of, just sort of like how to use this thing. So you can use the microphone to record text. We'll transcribe the audio. So this is a general purpose. So this uses Whisper. Whisper is a sound to text, audio to text model. So basically you can read into it and then it will transcribe the analysis from this. So let's try this here. I've actually never run this one, so I'm going to run it right alongside you. So it looks like we can record from microphone, or maybe we can, no, we can't just put it, maybe we can just put in text here. Well, let's just try it. So let's go record from microphone. Oh my God, I love cats so much. I love them a lot more than dogs. Let's go ahead and transcribe. And it looks like I need to check one of these. So let's do sentiment and score, and we'll do transcribe. There you go. So the sentiment analysis here is love, and it gives us a score of 96%, which is interesting because I did say I love them a lot more than dogs. So it's interesting that that didn't really capture, like, I don't know, some hatred against dogs. But yeah, so this is the cool thing about these sort of models is maybe you are here and you're like, but I don't need an audio to text model. This is actually like not useful for me. I want text to text. And that's where you might go back and try to dig around a little bit. Now, the other thing I'll say here is let's go back to the Hugging Face homepage. There are like these sort of landing pages for Hugging Face where basically it gives you categories. It's kind of hard. I don't really understand why they don't show up in search. I guess we could try a full text search and see if there's anything here. No, that just searches everything. So generally what I've actually done is I've done Hugging Face, and if I can spell correctly, this would work. Hugging Face text classifier. And here you go. Here is a whole page devoted to text classification. So if I click on this, you'll see there's a bunch of, I guess these are tutorials sort of on how they work. Interestingly enough, there was also a page that I had before. I wonder if I can find it. So, if you're more interested in the code side of things, or if you can read code, especially you can read Python, you'll find these pages super, super helpful, and they will go through the entire process of training. Now, because this is a class more for designers, I probably won't go through that, but I will go through training using some of their auto-train features, which I'll cover in a later video. But I want to see, let's see, here we go. This is what I was looking for. So what is text classification? So if I click on this, now this is literally, I took some screenshots of this for this class, but you'll see in here, this is a bunch of different options around different text classification options. So they've got, different tools using Quora, grammatical correctness. So this will cover a lot of different examples. And I wish they had like a better interface. Maybe it's if I go to tasks. Yeah, so here you go. This is perfect. This is what we want. So you'll go to huggingface.com/tasks, and you can see there are a ton of different tasks. And when you click on one of these, let's go to text to image. You'll see here that along the right-hand side, so there's a bunch of different discussions about this piece. There's also different data sets that cover this. There's models that cover this. And lastly, there are spaces that cover this. And obviously, different spaces, again, some of them might not work because they're out of date or they're broken. Other ones will. It's a little bit of the frustrating part of this. But in general, I find it's really helpful to be able to find just places to start from here, right? And you can send this to your developer and say, hey, do you understand how this works? You can send it to your product person and be does this achieve the goals we want? That sort of thing. The other thing is if you know something specifically that you want to look for, you can also use the search for this. So I know a couple months ago for a different class, I made a dog versus cat classifier. So let's say dog versus cat. And let's again be able to spell cat. You'll see here there are a bunch of different dog versus cats. There's even a data set here. There's cats versus dogs, and there's even spaces. So again, let's maybe grab one of these. We'll go to spaces. And let me just quickly find a photo of a cat. Okay, so we need to upload our image here. So we'll go to downloads. And here you go. This provides a classification here of cat and dog, as well as the percentage of the score. So this one really thinks it's cat and doesn't think it's all like a dog. Again, this is where you might want to play with what happens if I upload with a photo of a cat and a dog in it. What do I see there? But, you might decide oh, we kind of want to find one that really optimizes for cats, really optimizes for dogs, and you can play with each of these. Now, I should also mention, I know in some cases you might be oh, well, let's just implement this right away. You do need to check out the licenses for these models. A lot of these models are open source and sometimes non-commercial. Also, some of the data sets are non-commercial. So again, you really have to think about these as more of an R&D piece and less of a, we can just implement this model today. In some cases, maybe they are, a license that you can use, or maybe you're building a tool yourself for non-commercial usage, and you can therefore just use these. But I find Hugging Face is a really, really great tool just to kind of see the fire hose. And you may end up doing a lot of reading or a lot of sharing with your team, but it does give you the opportunity to at least begin to play with these models. And what I love about this, which only in the past couple of years has happened, is that you can actually like open one of these and play with it for free. Whereas before you used to have to download code, download models, run it locally, or use something like Colab, which is fine, but it takes a little bit of time to run. Here you've got a nice little interface. You can kind of start to see like what the scoring looks like with these things, or how they're operating. I don't know. Maybe in some cases you've got a model with a cat, dog, or a lizard. Maybe for every reason you really need a cat, dog, lizard model, and therefore you can kind of look around and find that. So this is a great starting point. It helps you find a ton of different stuff. Maybe you're looking for a data set. Maybe you're looking for individual models that already work that you want to implement in your tech stack. Or maybe you're just starting around and you want to play around and see what's out there and see if there's something you can work off of. So that's Hugging Face. So now let's move over to the next website. So Hugging Face is kind of the newest kid on the block in terms of like tools that people can use to find ML models and play with stuff. But before that, we had this site called Papers with Code, which I guess recently or maybe a couple years ago was bought by Facebook. But Papers with Code was probably the best option we had before Hugging Face. And I will admit that this one's a little bit more researcher and a little bit more code heavy. So for designers, this might be a little less helpful, but I do think it's helpful to sort of like explore the site and sort of see how it works, and then be able to maybe share this with your engineering team. So Papers with Code is basically just what it sounds like. It is research papers in the machine learning world or the artificial intelligence world. The way that new code is announced or new products are announced is usually through a research paper. So this literally collects all of the most frequently used or most interesting research papers alongside with their GitHub libraries. So when you come to the first page here, you'll see the trending research. So there is a code generation site that looks like, it's got a lot of stars. There's paper, there's code. This kind of goes back historically, like, maybe 5-7 years ago when I started. A lot of people would release papers and never release the code with them. And sort of what became the common pattern was, or like the demand was like, hey, you have to release the code alongside the paper so that people can either test your research or basically, if it's open source, begin to use those models. Now we're at a place where like Hugging Face is like, well, I want the paper, I want the code, I want the data set, and I want a live demo of the model that you trained. Papers with Code is kind of not yet at the like live space like the Hugging Face spaces are yet, but I still think it's pretty valuable to sort of look through this site and be able to find things. I tend to find it a lot for state-of-the-art stuff, so I want to know what the latest or newest model is that performs the best using a certain data set. And you'll see that's kind of what this site really does well, right? So it says browse state-of-the-art. So if we click on this, you'll see here that you have a bunch of different categories. This is very similar to sort of what we saw with the Hugging Face tasks. But let's say we want to look at, what should we look at? Let's say maybe look at music generation. So we click on music generation. You'll see here that there are libraries, and there are data sets, and there are benchmarks. Apparently, this is a bad example because there are currently no evaluation benchmarks. Benchmarks are essentially many fields or categories of AI agree on the same sort of testing scenario and the metrics to sort of see how well a model is working. So in this case, there isn't one, but it is helpful to sort of see like what libraries or what GitHub pages people are looking at. So for example, like if you were really going to look at music generation, you might want to look at Microsoft, because apparently this has 5 papers related to it and has nearly 4,000 stars on GitHub. And that's really, really helpful to know. Popularity isn't always the best way to like explore these models, but especially if you're just starting out in a field, like you're just starting out in a category, it's definitely helpful to start there, because one, this library is like likely to work. There's a lot of problems with machine learning code where stuff doesn't work or it's like been abandoned by the creators, that sort of thing. So at least with this, it's Microsoft and it's got 4,000 stars, which means it's probably going to be looked at, or like people are going to keep an eye on it and people are going to make updates to it, that sort of thing. Let's go back to one that actually has some metrics on it. So let's go to text-based. Let's go to natural language processing. So let's go to text generation. And so here you'll see, again, we have sort of a brief description of what text generation is. Then we've got our benchmarks. We'll come back to benchmarks in a minute. And then we've got our libraries. These are the libraries that most people are using for these tools. If you haven't heard of Hugging Face Transformers, it's probably the most important library in most of machine learning today, transformers is like the biggest category, and that is sort of, you can see that here. It's got 120,000 stars. But also data sets. I think if you were looking at that, the text classification tool before, you'll kind of see something similar there from Hugging Face. Glue was, I think, the number one data set on their end as well. So let's take a look at how benchmarks work. So benchmarks are essentially they're scored based on a data set, and then they're run through a set of processes to determine what the best score is. So I would imagine it's like, how do these models work against Chinese poems, right? So how well do they generate Chinese poems? And there's usually some mathematic process to figure out the metrics. It's not like a human scoring sort of system. There's also Yahoo questions. So these are run against popular data sets. So you'll see Coco Captions. Coco Captions is, Coco is an object description model or an object detection model. So apparently there's a caption model that will allow you to caption those objects. And next to it, you'll see what the best model is. And this is basically whatever GitHub model exists and how it performs. So apparently LeetGAN does pretty well on, I don't know what this one is, EMNLP 2017 WMT. Again, text generation is not my forte, but it seems to look like it does well for these two. Let's see, show all 161 benchmarks. So, again, there's also this one called BART. So I'm just sort of looking here to be like, oh, what do I want to do? Well, maybe Chinese poems is actually really what I want to do, and therefore I should look at this model. In this case, let's just click on looking at LeetGAN. So I think if we click on here, it just opens this up, and then we can click here, long text generation via adversarial training with leaked information. And you'll see here now you have access to the repository. This is the official repository from on GitHub. You see it's official. It's got the most stars. So if we open this up, you'll see here that we have a bunch of code. Now, again, the downside here is that there's often no way to run this in something like Hugging Face. But one thing we could do is let's take this into Hugging Face and see if someone put this model up. Nope, no one put this up. So this is a challenge of some of these tools, and especially this is where Papers with Code at the time was great, and I personally know how to run a lot of these models through something like Colab, but you probably don't, and that is where it's kind of frustrating. So this is where I would probably lean toward Hugging Face for most of you, why I cover this first. But if you are interested in the code side of things, or you are more of a GitHub person and you really want to learn how to run this stuff, I would definitely recommend taking a look at Papers with Code. So again, just 2 websites to help you sort of get started finding models, experiment with models, and obviously for this class, if you have questions or you want to learn a little bit more about what each of these things means, please reach out to me over Slack, and I'm happy to talk about that. So hopefully throughout the course we'll be looking at these. I think we'll probably use Hugging Face a frequent amount, in part because it already has that GUI, and that GUI will kind of tell us how certain things will work. It's ugly, it's default, but it does exist, and it makes finding a model and playing with the model way, way easier. So we'll probably be looking at that a lot through this course, but I just want to cover these two because I think it's a common question that people ask me about.